You are the imaginal cells of the butterfly, says Jack Kornfield in episode 283 of Heart Wisdom. This is a wonderful video episode presented by Be Here Now Network, originally recorded for the Spirit Rock Monday Night Dharma Talk and live stream, which Jack does generally monthly, and Spirit Rock has every Monday night. Lately, Jacks have been quite, I don't want to say political, but he's speaking deeply to the transformation that society is going under due to the causes and conditions of the current zeitgeist. And one of the more beautiful things that he's been doing is, rather than shaking us awake with fear politics, which seems to be happening everywhere you go, if you happen to walk into somewhere where a TV is on and the news happens to be blaring, or if you just swipe to whatever the next reel is on Instagram, it's right there too. So what Jack offers through his teachings, what he learned through Ajahn Chah and Mahagosananda, how to become an island of peace and hope, how to be a beacon, like Thich Nhat Hanh says, for those who could use a little light. Well, the metaphoric and poetic beauty of Jack's words in this episode are not lost. This is the imaginal cells of the butterfly. What he offers us is the reflection that the caterpillar has no idea what's going on when it's starting to cocoon, but when it goes into its hibernating kind of soupy goopy process, there's these cells that come out, these imaginal cells, Jack says they're called. And these cells help the butterfly imagine itself into this new, beautiful form. And Jack's been talking about Joanna Macy and her idea that this is the great turning, the great change times for humanity, because we are reaching that precipice. We may have already reached the precipice. But either way, this seems to be the time of great change, whether that's environmental, whether that's political, whether that's financial, whether that is psychedelic, or whether that is with AI. This is a time of change, and a time that our momentum, our current momentum, needs to be rerouted into something that's more fair and compassionate and in flow with nature and the Tao. So what Jack shares here is that it's almost like society is going through a transformation, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. And what he invites us into is the recognition that each of us is an imaginal cell, a growth point of potentiality for the beautiful butterfly that society has the opportunity to evolve into right before our eyes through us. So it's each of our duty to, like last week, share our unique gift with the world, dream our unique dream, stand up for what matters, stand up for compassion, for we are the imaginal cells of this new, beautiful butterfly that society is becoming. I know it may seem grim out there, but probably seems pretty grim for the caterpillar as it's sloughing itself into its little cocoon and melting. So hopefully this episode had some hope to your life. And at the very least, it's great to be able to sit back, relax, and listen to Jack. Because when he is really feeling it, there's something special that comes through. And that is exactly what Jack is inviting you into in this episode. I'll be quick on the housekeeping. April 7th, Jack has a Monday Night Dharma Talk. So if you are enjoying this episode, you can tune in live for the next one. It's at spiritrock.org at the calendar, or jackkornfield.com at the calendar. And then this is a very cool opportunity. Jack is going to be relaunching his masterclass in guided meditation. He shares how to lead people through some of their deepest, most interactive spelunkings into their own intuitive wisdom. is literally a class where Jack teaches you how to guide others through powerful guided meditations. If that seems for you, that starts on April 7th at jackkornfield.com. Other than that, there's the Year of Awakening for a year of hangs with Jack, and just a constant beautiful stream of Dharma offerings, articles, meditations, and so much more at jackkornfield.com. So thank you for being here as always. This is such a beautiful and poetic video episode. 283, The Imaginal Cells of the Butterfly. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you help others through the authenticity of your being, and may you imagine a beautiful evolution for the great turning of society. Namaste.
Before I start to talk this evening, because often I'll create a kind of crafted talk of teachings and examples and stories in a systematic way, and then we have a conversation afterward. For tonight, I want to do something different. And I'd like to be able to speak, but also to respond to where you are, to what are your concerns, or what are the themes you wish we could touch on. Maybe we'll also have some dialogue with this. So I invite you, let's open the chat, to put into the chat the themes or topics or words of what you're looking for, hope, or what's going on for you that we might talk about together. Thank you, Julian. Let's see what comes up. How to cope with the stress and anxiety of the current administration or the destruction in the country, balancing self-care with compassion and action, stability of heart, uncertainty, grief, fear of sickness, maintaining sanity while watching destruction, balancing doom scrolling with head in the sand, being overwhelmed, self-care versus activism, how to send love and blessings to all people, compassion with boundaries, how do I focus on the positive and stay present, giving my gifts, watching late-stage capitalism disregard humans, the despair of the news, how to help those with memory issues to remember how to meditate, how to understand that there are other views of what's going on. Remember that spring always follows winter. How to not feel guilty for feeling safe. Overwhelmed. Okay. This was going to be a couple hours, but I'm afraid we'll be here all night. Might as well relax. What I love about hearing from you, even though it's difficult, is somehow the sense that we're in this together. How do I stay centered? How do I take care of my family? How do I quiet myself and also act in the world? And how to do so with a joyful heart? How do I deal with the struggles? You know, how to avoid or work with feeling overwhelmed. And if you look at the screen and see the little faces in the squares, or you're on the, Facebook live stream or whatever, we're in this together. And it doesn't mean there aren't some conservatives on the screen. And there's some really important conservative values, the best of them that we need. So this isn't a political statement, but it's a Dharma statement. As Thich Nhat Hanh again repeated often when the crowded Vietnamese refugee boats met with storms or pirates, if everyone panicked, all would be lost. But if even one person remained centered and calm, it showed the way for everyone to survive. And you know who that one person is. And that's how the world is made. It's made from us, from our hearts and our being. And so maybe the first thing is just that we allow ourselves time to be present, to walk in nature, to turn off the damn news. You kind of know the plot. It's like reading a Shakespearean tragedy in many cases. But you know it. And quiet your mind, tend your heart. And also, as you do, in some way, perhaps not get into the game of blame of who's right and wrong. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian activist and author, he said, if only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessarily simply to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who among us is willing to destroy a piece of our heart? So in a way, what we're seeing kind of concerns some people put in the chat is really a symptom of our humanity. Here we are, 21st century, late stage capitalism, which has gotten to the place where there's further extremes of rich and poor or exploitation. And we're at the time what Joanna Macy calls the great turning, kind of the great opportunity, really, for us to reset our lives as human beings. Now, what's also true about the great turning is that it's a birth process. I don't know how many of you have given birth, but I imagine looking at the screen that some of you would raise your hands. And it's messy. It's painful. It's dangerous. It's difficult. And we are in some kind of a birth process. And all the things that we see are not just these are terrible things, but they're also symptoms of our fear as human beings. We're kind of wired to fear the other. And our politics is all about fear. The great commentators about politics, the whole aim of politics is to frighten the populace into voting for you. That was 100 years ago, that commentary. But that's not who we are at heart. That's the small, separate self, the body of fear. But the Buddhist texts also begin, O nobly born, remember who you are. Remember your fearlessness in the midst of it all. Center yourself. Thomas Jefferson said something like, one person with courage is a majority. And I used to have on my refrigerator a picture of that Chinese man with the shopping bag standing in front of that line of tanks. Remember that image? Maybe after Tiananmen Square, and the tanks stopped and he had his shopping bags. But how do we do this? We have to stay in the present, because if you let yourself get drowned by the news and the fears and the thoughts, you'll go swimming and rising and falling in the ocean of grief and fear. And that's not who you are. Meditation invites you to have a very different perspective. You know, when a butterfly makes a chrysalis, we used to think as kids, and we were told this, that it would grow its wings, right? There's the caterpillar, and that it adds some wings and it comes out and it flies. But now we know, all the science shows us, that something very different. It dissolves. It becomes a gelatinous mass of cells, some of which are related to the old butterfly, to the old caterpillar, and some other cells which have a beautiful name. They're called imaginal cells. And these are the cells that picture that they can fly. What a wild thing for those cells to believe that. But honestly, they do. They carry that image, that imagination, that possibility. And apparently there's some struggle there in the chrysalis about who's going to win out. Can we go back to the old caterpillar? I don't think so. And gradually the imaginal cells begin to build the wings of the butterfly. But it's not easy. Things fall apart. And I say that lightly, but actually there can be tremendous suffering. And we can see it. Part of our practice and our training is the capacity to bear witness to the ocean of tears, as well as the wondrous glory of the world and the universe. The beauty that surrounds us, and nature keeps showing us amazing things. And it keeps getting reborn no matter what you do. It will reborn. It will push through the cracks in the sidewalk. You try to pave it over, baby, it's coming back. It's just what it does. It renews itself. So there's a kind of trust that's asked. And there's a story. Remember Black Elk? Black Elk was a great medicine man of his people. And he was, celebrated. And he had this beautiful vision on Harney Peak about the circle of life. And part of the vision was the way the native people his people would again come together and live in the harmony they had before. And in the beautiful biography of Black Elk Speaks, William Neihardt, who interviewed him and lived with him at the end of his life and became partly his voice, he was with Black Elk. And Black Elk was an old man now at the end of his life, as Neihardt writes. And he wanted to go back and visit the top of Harney Peak, where he was blessed by a vision of the sacred hoop of the world that inspired his whole life and so many people. And so he put on his finest headdress and painted himself as one does to meet the gods, and took a sacred pipe and asked for a blessing, honoring the goodness and beauty of the sacred tree. And he walked up the top of Harney Peak. And Nyhart said it was a clear blue sky. And yet Black Elk had told him that, in fact, if his life was any value, the rains would come. This is a very dry part of the Dakotas. But the clouds would part and bring some rain as a blessing from the Great Spirit. And he climbed up. The sky was perfectly clear. And there were tourists looking at this old man and his headdress and paint, like wondering. And it was in the midst of a season of drought, one of the worst in years. And he lay himself on the ground at the top of Harney Peak and made a prayer that if he had lived righteously, that the gods would somehow bless him with rain. And Nyhart said, to his astonishment, some clouds appeared just over that part of the mountain, and a light rain began to fall. And Black Elk lay there and smiled and somehow knew, even though he didn't succeed in reweaving the sacred hoop in the way that he intended, that his life was not in vain. There are some bigger forces than what you know, bigger than politics, bigger than even climate change, bigger than AI. And these are all huge forces. Don't get me wrong. But in another way, they're trivial. They're trivial compared to the forces of the turning of the seasons and the return of life. As Pablo Neruda says, you can pick all the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. There's another force. And that's what we're asked to remember, something mysterious and great, and to quiet ourselves and align ourselves. And then, of course, to begin to act, but to act not in the way of fear. You know, I tell that story, I might have told it a month ago, of our colleague, my beloved friend, Wes Nisker, who died a couple of years ago, visiting Gary Snyder, the great environmentalist now in his 90s, who got the Pulitzer Prize for his environmental writing 50, 60 years ago, Earth Household, saying, Gary, the oceans are rising, the deserts are growing, refugees everywhere, animals going extinct, the ice floes melting. What advice do you have? You've been an environmentalist for more than half a century. And he looked back and he said, don't feel guilty. Don't feel guilty. If you want to save it, don't save it out of guilt. Don't save it out of fear. Don't save it out of anger. Because the guilt and the fear and the anger are what has created our human problems. This is the source of it. If you want to save it because you love it. That's the force that makes a difference. You know, that's the power that does so. So what you do when you meditate is you let yourself sit with heartbreak. How many have heartbreak? Don't bother raising your hands. We know you. How many have felt guilt or fear? Okay. And then here's Gary saying, don't save it out of fear, out of confusion and guilt, doom scrolling, all these things which will come in these times. But the end of Mary Oliver's poem about the last day of the Buddha, where he lies under the two sal trees, in his last words, as the trees break into blossom, and he looks up and he says, make of yourself a light. It's usually carried like be a lamp unto yourself, but Mary Oliver's better than that. She says, make of yourself a light. So I'm going to pause for a moment. We could get practical in a few minutes, but I'm really talking about the value of learning how to embody that nobility and dignity that is who you are. And we human beings go through horrible times and world wars and tremendous human caused suffering. How will you carry yourself? And what light will you carry? Because you can, you know. Let's open the chat again for comments for a moment. See what comes. Maybe we'll even have a little conversation. How are you doing? What is it that's here to say if there are words in the chat? Or maybe you're just quiet. I go to nature to relieve the grief, do it out of love. Such a powerful message because it's a shared message. We see each other. We're actually holding hands in spirit, even here. And you know why you get afraid? Do you know why you get angry and upset? You know why? Because you care. Underneath all that, the fear and the anger and all of that, it comes because you care. And in meditation, the invitation is to drop beneath. You can see the anger and the fear and all that. That's being human. Like Solzhenitsyn said, who doesn't have that in their heart? But underneath that, for you, is the sense that care. Poetry helps, arts help, from our friends on Facebook. A bigger picture. I feel like I should be doing something and make a difference, but what? Do it out of love breaks my heart open. Music helps. You know, a couple of days ago, being up in Truckee, there was a big demonstration of people out on the street who were concerned about the firing of the USAID and the money that would go to feed children who are hungry or starving, would go to give medicine to those who are sick. And the thing that struck me, Truckee's a small town, I think 4,000 people. Hundreds of people came out. And there were so many creative signs. It was amazing, the creativity. And that day, which was a couple of days ago, so many people came out for a long time. It took about a day to organize. And it was done by a high school student. He said, we got to get out there. And he started calling the other students, and they all started calling their friends and their parents and their cousins. And in a day or so, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds in this small town appeared with their signs of love and their signs of concern. Of course, there are signs of frustration and anger. There were all of them. I mean, part of it is it's so creative, actually, when when you're standing up. It's here. It's in us. And you say, well, what should I do? Go out in nature, supported by children and grandchildren. Yeah, they're rooting for you. And sometimes it's just small things. But I think about in Italy, during the pandemic, people began to sing to one another from the balconies when they couldn't visit each other. And then they began to bang their pots. Remember that? It's really simple. We should have a pot banging day for people who are concerned. It also helps to have a big picture. If we think about the Great Turning, I remember being on the top of Mount Tamalpais. I've talked about this before. Some years ago, and Mount Tam is the 2,500-foot mountain in the middle of Marin County. So it's our local mountain. And it was a day of the passage of the planet Venus across the face of the sun. And so I drove up because I read about it. And at the top, there were a bunch of amateur astronomers who brought their telescopes, some with pretty big telescopes. And so I got to look in the big telescope, and there was the sun. And if you get to look close at it, first of all, it's kind of wiggly. It's not like bright orange disk. It's like looking into a fiery, moving, amazing thing all the time. It was astonishing to see how alive this being, the sun, is considered a being or a god in all these indigenous cultures. They could be right. This thing was really alive in these ways. And then at one corner, there was this little dark marble, very tiny compared to the big disk of the sun. And then as I watched for 5 minutes, I could see that it moved a tiny bit. I went away and it came back and it moved a little further. And then I looked and I said, oh, that's Venus. It's about the same size as planet Earth, like us, the same size. And it's wending its way around our great star like we do. And there's this vast space, and it's traveling around like our planet does. I could feel us. There's this huge solar system space and these little tiny marbles going around our star in this wonderful way. And then we get upset. Sometimes I go about pitying myself, said the Ojibwe, when all the while I'm being carried by great winds across the sky. And so there's something about trusting Black Elk vision that there's something bigger. And then you're called in the darkest times and the most difficult times to remember who you are and to treat one another from that place of dignity and respect, how nobly born. In a way, that's what we've been practicing for, some of us for a very long time. And it doesn't take a lot. Gestures of kindness, asking others how you can help, and then tuning and listening. Who is doing things that make a difference? Is there a new underground railroad that's growing to shelter people who otherwise might be in danger? Would you want to be a stop on that underground railroad if that was the right thing for you? Yeah. We will get through this, and we'll get through it because we do it together. There's an amazing book called Bury the Chains by Adam Hochschild. And it's the story primarily of a man named Thomas Clarkson. And Thomas Clarkson aligned himself. He might have been a Quaker, or he aligned himself with the Quakers. And he was one of the activists in England that was fighting against the slave trade. And in the 1700s, in the 1800s, a lot of the wealth of the British Empire came from slaving and then from slave plantations, if you call them that, slave colonies, penal colonies, especially in the Caribbean islands and Central America and all those places where you can grow sugarcane, because sugarcane was the oil of the time and it brought great wealth. And they knew, the Quakers especially knew that this was immoral and it was wrong. And 6 of them got together in a English tea house and said, we're going to change this. And they all vowed in their own way to make a difference. And Clarkson in some way became the head of them. And he rode for 30 years. He rode tens of thousands of miles back and forth across England, meeting especially with the English gentry and the people who had wealth or power, or in some way were part of those who ran the society. And he brought with him often an ex-slave, somebody who had been somehow released or able to get to England, and who was well-spoken, who described what it was like, the Middle Passage, to be chained in the hold of a ship with hundreds of others and no food, what it was like to be whipped and beaten. And here in the nice parlors of the English gentry, Thomas Clarkson went from place to place to place. 30 years it took him. And at the end of it, it wasn't just him, of course. It was a movement from the Quakers and others. The English Parliament came together, and with the force of their movement, they outlawed slavery. They probably did it in some stages, as I remember, to be accurate. First, no more taking of slaves, then no more keeping of slaves. I'm telling you this because it takes a while, especially in huge social change time. But you are the imaginal cells. You're the ones who are called to hold the vision of a wise society where people respect each other, where we care for the vulnerable, where we understand the universal teachings: hatred never ends by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is you.